When my grandmother died, something inside me broke in a way I didn't expect. Not just from grief, though that was there too, but from the silence that came after. No more phone calls. No more letters in her elegant, looping cursive. No more, "Lizzie, don't let them walk all over you," said with that soft yet steel-edged voice of hers. She had been my compass for as long as I could remember, and when I stood beside her casket, holding back tears, I kept hearing her say, "A smart woman plans for what no one else sees coming." At the time, I didn't know just how true that would become. The day after the funeral, my husband, Mark, came into the kitchen holding 2 mugs of coffee. One for me, one for him. He set mine down in front of me, kissed my forehead, and said, "You okay?" I nodded. "I miss her." "I know," he said, his voice warm and low. "She meant a lot to you." I looked at him. My husband, the man I'd been married to for almost 12 years. Charming, confident, steady. Everyone said I was lucky, and for the most part, I believed them. But then he added almost casually, "Did she leave you anything?" I blinked. "What?" "Your grandmother. In the will." "Did she leave you an inheritance or anything?" "Not that it matters, of course. I'm just curious." It was such an odd question. Out of place. Cold. He smiled to soften it, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not sure yet," I said, carefully. "Her lawyer is contacting the family this week." He nodded and changed the subject. But something about the way he asked, that timing, didn't sit right. Later that night, I went to the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. But I remembered something. A letter. One she gave me when I turned 21. "For when I'm gone," she'd said with a half smile. I had never opened it. But now it felt like I needed her voice more than ever. I found it tucked inside a box marked recipes. Typical of Grandma Agnes, always hiding the important stuff in plain sight. The letter was short. "Lizzie, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if Mark's still around, listen to me. Don't trust anyone with your money, not even the man you married. Love isn't blind. It's just very good at pretending to be. I've made arrangements. You'll know when the time comes. Protect what's yours. Love, Grandma." My hands shook as I read it. My heart raced. I had no idea what arrangements she meant. But I knew one thing for certain. The time had come. Have you ever found something, an old letter, a passing comment, that made you question everything you thought you knew about someone? Would you open that door to the truth, or walk away? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories so you won't miss what happens when Liz discovers exactly what her grandmother had planned behind the scenes. The lawyer's office was a modest brownstone in the old part of town. Quiet, respectable, the kind of place that looked like it had secrets tucked into the wallpaper. I arrived 10 minutes early, hands damp, heart tight in my chest. The receptionist greeted me with a soft smile. "Ms. Elizabeth Mason?" "Yes," I said, straightening my spine. "She left very specific instructions," the receptionist said, leading me into a private conference room. "You're the only one allowed in for this portion of the reading." Inside, an older woman, with silver hair and sharp eyes, stood as I entered. "Elizabeth," she said, "I'm Ms. Evans, your grandmother's personal attorney and, believe it or not, one of her oldest friends." I blinked. I thought Mr. Caldwell was her lawyer. He handled her estate, publicly. I handled everything else, She opened a leather-bound folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. "She wanted you to read this before anything else," Miss Evans said, sliding it across the table. I took a breath and opened the envelope. "Lizzie, if you're here, then I'm gone. And Mark has probably started circling like a vulture. I knew he'd try something. That's why I left instructions with Miss Evans. Do not sign anything he puts in front of you. Do not merge your inheritance. Do not underestimate what you're capable of. Everything I built is now yours. Keep it safe. Use it wisely. And never forget, a quiet woman can be the most dangerous kind. All my love. Grandma." I looked up at Miss Evans, eyes wide. She nodded. "There's more. She left a clause in her trust specifically preventing any spousal access to your inheritance. It cannot be shared, merged, or leveraged by a partner. Not without your written, notarized consent." I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to loosen. "So, even if he tries, he'll fail," she said simply. "But only if you don't give him the opening." That night, I didn't say a word to Mark. He asked how the meeting went, and I smiled. "Fine. Mostly paperwork." He grinned and handed me a glass of wine. "We should really talk to a financial advisor soon. You know, before you make any big decisions. I can set something up. Let me think on it," I replied. But I already knew. I wasn't going to think on anything. I was going to watch, listen, and wait, because if Mark wanted a game, I was ready to play. It started with the little things. Mark began leaving financial documents on the kitchen counter. "Just for transparency," he said with a charming grin. They were dense, full of numbers and legal language, but always accompanied by a yellow sticky note. "Sign when you get a chance, babe." I stopped reading after the third one. I started making copies instead. He began talking more about our future, tossing out terms like joint investments, portfolio consolidation, asset alignment. It sounded impressive. It also sounded rehearsed. One afternoon, I found him pacing in the garage, on a hushed phone call. I stayed in the shadows and listened. "I told you she's going to sign. It's just a matter of time. Once the money's moved, we're clear." My stomach dropped. He wasn't talking to a financial advisor. He was talking to someone about me. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I called Miss Evans. "We need to move up the plan," I told her. "He's not just circling anymore. He's hunting." Over the next week, I followed his pattern. Mark had meetings at strange hours, took phone calls in the bathroom, and once left his laptop open just long enough for me to snap a photo of a suspicious email thread. The subject line made my skin crawl. "Liquidity strategy. Liz's trust." The final straw came on a Thursday morning. Mark made us breakfast. Eggs, toast, my favorite coffee, and sat across from me with a stack of papers. "I talked to a new advisor. Super smart guy. I think we should roll your inheritance into a blended trust. It'll maximize growth, tax shelter, all that good stuff." He slid the paperwork toward me like it was nothing. "Just sign here," he said, tapping the line with his pen. "I'll take care of the rest." I stared at him. So easy, so smooth, so sure I wouldn't question him. I smiled. "I'll need a few days," I said. "You know me. I like to be thorough." He tried not to look irritated. "Sure, babe, take your time. Just don't wait too long. The market's shifting fast." That night, I called Miss Evans again. "It's time," I said. I want him to walk straight into his own trap. Ms. Evans moved like a chess master, quiet, patient, and always 3 moves ahead. "I'll draft the response," she said calmly. "We'll make it look like you're interested but hesitant. That'll keep him engaged. And talking. We agreed to a controlled setup. She would review every document Mark sent. Every phone call from his advisor would be recorded. Every move documented. I wasn't just protecting my inheritance now. I was building a case. 2 days later, Mark suggested we meet with his advisor in person. "Just a quick meeting," he said. "He can explain the legal stuff better than I can." I already booked the conference room at his firm. I agreed, smiled, wore my nicest navy dress and the pearls Grandma Agnes had given me. Mark looked at me like I was his next great business. Deal. When we arrived, his so-called advisor was waiting. Slick hair, firm handshake, an expensive watch he kept checking. "We've already structured the trust paperwork," he said confidently, opening a leather folio. "All we need is your signature here. And here. 2 pages. That's all they showed me. But I'd seen the real paperwork, the full paperwork, earlier that morning thanks to Ms. Evans, who had intercepted a draft from the notary office. What they handed me now was a redacted version, watered down, clean. The rest, the part that would grant Mark full financial control over my inheritance, was hidden in the attached schedules and subclauses. I smiled and leaned forward. "I appreciate the explanation," I said. "But I actually brought my own counsel today." The door opened. Ms. Evans stepped in, her heels tapping softly against the polished floor. Mark's face dropped so fast, it was almost comical. "Ms. Evans is my grandmother's attorney," I said calmly. "And mine now." Mark stood up. "Liz, what is this?" "This," Ms. Evans said, setting down her own folder, "is the part where you sit down and listen very carefully." The advisor's smug grin vanished. "We've reviewed the full trust restructuring proposal," she continued. "And we're prepared to file an injunction for attempted financial coercion, should you continue down this path." Mark looked stunned. "That's absurd. I was trying to help her manage your debts," I cut in. "You were trying to manage your debts with my inheritance." His face flushed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," I said, pulling out a folder of my own. Bank statements, email screenshots, phone logs, all. Printed, all dated, all damning. I know about the offshore accounts, the shell company, the second mortgage you took out without telling me. The room went dead silent. Ms. Evans slid a final paper across the table. "This is a formal cease and desist. If you contact my client again regarding her assets, we'll escalate immediately." Mark opened his mouth, but no words came. I stood, turned to Ms. Evans and said with a calm, "I didn't know I had. Let's go." For the first time in a long time, I felt light, not because it was over, but because I was finally in control of how it would end. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Within a week, word started spreading through Mark's professional circle. The advisor, clearly rattled by Ms. Evans' warning, pulled out of their dealings entirely. His name was quietly scrubbed from several websites. One of Mark's business partners reached out to me, not with concern, but curiosity. "Is it true?" he asked over the phone. "That he tried to move your inheritance into his holding company?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. What mattered now was protecting what was mine. I filed for divorce the following Monday. Clean, cold, calculated. There were no dramatic arguments, no begging, no promises to change. Mark tried, of course, texted, emailed, even sent flowers. But none of that mattered anymore. Once the truth is out, no amount of charm can fix what it destroyed. Through Ms. Evans, I negotiated a firm financial boundary. He would not touch a single cent of my inheritance. Not now, not ever. The prenup, once mocked by Mark as just a formality, was airtight. Ironically, it was Grandma who insisted I sign it before we married. Because love is sweet, she'd said. But paperwork is power. His company, already teetering, took a final blow when one of his lenders pulled out, citing credibility concerns. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled. For the first time in years, I could breathe without asking permission. Moved out of the house a few weeks later. Took nothing but my clothes, a few books, and Grandma's locket. I didn't need the rest. Starting over felt less like a loss and more like shedding old skin. With Ms. Evans's help, I used a portion of my inheritance to establish the Agnes Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping women regain financial independence after abusive or controlling relationships. We offered legal aid, financial literacy workshops, emergency relocation support. I met dozens of women who'd lived through versions of my story, some worse, some heartbreakingly familiar, and every time one of them cried or laughed or simply said thank you, I felt my grandmother beside me, nodding in quiet approval. My life wasn't what I imagined it would be. It was better, not easier, but mine. A year later, I stood in the sunlit foyer of a little coastal cottage I now called home. It wasn't big, and it didn't need to be. The floors creaked. The windows opened wide to salt air and the hush of waves. It had once belonged to Grandma Agnes, back when she was just starting over too. I found her old sketchbook tucked between cookbooks in the kitchen drawer. On the last page, she had scribbled something in pencil. There is no greater freedom than a woman who owns her name, her time, and her bank account. I smiled. Some afternoons I taught workshops from my living room, Zoom calls with women across the country. Some were newly divorced. Some had just left their jobs. Some were still quietly saving money in envelopes under mattresses, waiting for the right moment to reclaim themselves. They listened to my story. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. I'd become what Grandma always hoped I would be. Not just someone who survived, but someone who knew why she had. And when the Agnes Foundation hosted its first retreat, I stood in front of a room full of women, every age, every background, and told them the truth. I was married to a man who looked at me like I was fragile, who tried to wrap his control in kindness, who underestimated me. Pause. And he was wrong. The room erupted in quiet nods and soft murmurs of recognition. As the retreat ended, one woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "How did you know it was time to fight back?" she whispered. I looked out the window, toward the sea. When I realized being quiet wasn't the same as being weak, she exhaled slowly. So did I, because sometimes the softest voice carries the sharpest truth, and the ones they underestimate are always the ones they should have feared most. What would you do if the person you trusted most tried to steal what you built, just because he thought you weren't paying attention? Have you ever been underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I know other women do too. If this story hit close to home, or lit something in you, tap that like button and subscribe to Sophia's Revenge Stories for more tales of betrayal, justice, and powerful comebacks. And hey, if you think Liz made the right move, comment 2 below. But if you would have walked away even sooner, Type 7. I want to know how you would have handled it. Until next time, stay strong, stay smart, and remember, the quiet ones are never as helpless as they seem.